How about now?
Oh, much better.
I always switch this off in case I need to go to the restroom. Anyway, good morning. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I didn't realize it was your 10th year, so congratulations, that's fantastic. I am not going to sing, but what I am going to do is spend about 20 minutes or so trying to create a framework for the future of HR. Now, you'll probably recognize by my accent, not only am I English, I'm from the northeast of England, from near a place called Newcastle. And we have a particular accent. And when we get excited or carried away by a topic, some things happen to the accent. One, I speak faster. And secondly, I start using dialect words. And about the only person I think who'd probably understand some of my dialect is Evan from Norway, because we have some commonalities, because the Norwegians spent a lot of time invading the north of England many years ago, and they left a lot. There's a lot of blonde people in the north of England as well, all to do with the Vikings. So if I start speaking too quickly, please let me know. I will be around for the rest of the day, so if there's something you want to talk about later or ask me questions, please feel free to come and see me. And I can try and explain a bit more slowly than quickly. Just to give you an example of my dialect, by the way, normally in England, when you ask, if you're agreeing with somebody, you'd say yes. Yeah? In the northeast of England, we say why aye. So it's quite different in terms of dialect. So I'll try not to do that. But what I want to do today is leave you with 3 key messages. And those 3 messages are that it's time HR moved away from following what are called fads and fashions, or if you like, benchmarking and best practice, and move towards principles. And I'll explain more about that later. But there's an obsession in the HR world with best practice and benchmarking. And I'm afraid that's not what's going to make a difference. The thing that will make a difference, and the second message for you, is that context is king. So good HR is all about how you manage in your context. And the third thing I want to leave you with is that we need to put the human back into human resources. We have moved away too much from understanding how people work, collaborate, and operate effectively together. So they're the 3 sort of key messages. Now let's move on. Just a little bit, one of my roles is chair of the board of CIPD in the UK, and this is our mission. Oops, go back. It's really all about our purpose in the world is to improve practices in people and organisation development for the benefit of individuals, businesses, economies and society. And that's because there's a virtual cycle. Good human resource management, good people management means that usually you have good business, and good business means good economies. There's a lot of good research being done on this. But this is what I'm going to cover in the next sort of less than 20 minutes now. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking about context. What will the future workforce look like? What are the challenges that are facing us? But how do we manage this in the future? What's the framework for effective, professional, credible HR in the future? So that's the agenda. So let's start. There's some key themes. Sorry, I'm still live, yeah. There are some key themes or mega themes affecting the world of work at the moment. One is globalization and economic change. Now, I'm not going to go through these in huge detail, and you can talk about them later if you want, but it's really about setting the scene for the conference. But we're living in what's known as a VUCA world. Everybody's heard the expression VUCA by now, I think. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Does anybody know where that expression came from, by the way? It came from Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense for the US some years ago. And that was his view of the world, and it's come into common usage. But globalization means that countries and companies are increasingly interdependent. We can't any longer just survive in an insular sort of way. And of course, at the moment, there's massive economic change taking place in Europe. Not just in the globe, but particularly in Europe. And of course, as a Brit, I'm in the middle of all the discussion around Brexit. Yeah? That wonderful invented word, and the impact of that, not just on the UK, but the impact on Europe. We're in a world which is called the smack world. Now, this is not smacking your kids, or smacking your colleague, or your partner. This is a social, mobile, analytical, and a world with the cloud. Technology and digital are changing our world as we actually stand here. And it's moving at such an exponential pace, we're not even understanding how we can use it at the moment. And the third mega trend is in workforce and demographics. If you look at the demographics of the workforce across Europe, there are some pretty frightening messages in some countries. For example, in Germany, one of the reasons, by the way, Germany's accepting lots of migrants is because they have an aging population. They've got a very, very old, in fact, I think it's something now 40+% or over 60. When you start looking at demographics in different countries, some countries are very young, some are actually very old. And that's why migration is such an issue at the moment. But the other interesting thing is because there are some countries with younger populations, their expectations are very, very different to those with an older population, and that creates a tension. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Just want to say a little about social media. This data, when I put it together, was accurate. Now it's out of date, and that was since last week. But just to give you an idea of what's happening in the world of social media, how it's been actually used and how it impacts on us. But interesting, 67% of all networking traffic happens in the workplace. So what are people actually doing? Is it beneficial? Hopefully most of it is. 50% of 21-year-olds have created their own web content. Amazing stuff. I love this one. 1 in 8 marriages result from an initial contact on the internet. Did anybody hear a few months ago about the data hacking for a company called Ashley Madison out of the States? And Ashley Madison is an interesting company. It's a company that was set up to promote affairs. And their data got hacked. So now there's probably 1 in 8 divorces resulting from use of the internet, I think. 100 billion Google searches are conducted each month. We heard about one this morning. It's amazing how many people Google somebody before they even meet them. Yeah. How many people do that, by the way? Do you Google people before you meet them? I do. Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing what you find out. 36% of all adults online use Wikipedia. Now that's a really, really interesting statistic because the majority of Wikipedia's data is flawed. So if you're looking for information or data from Wikipedia, you really need to check it. But that's an amazing amount of social media. When you start looking at the future workforce, that has a key effect on the diversity and the workforce that we have. This is a sort of very broad brush division of the current workforce. You have the traditionalists who are still in work, who were born up to 1945. We've all heard of baby boomers, who are now, by the way, being called the me generation. They're being called the me generation because grandparents are refusing to save their money. They're spending it on themselves and not leaving it to their kids or grandkids. There's quite interesting stuff going on. We have Generation X and then Generation Y. The reason for putting that slide up is each of those generations has a different view of the world in the workplace. They have different expectations. They need to be managed in quite different ways. Now, when you look at most workplaces, certainly in long-established economies, Most of the people who actually direct or run the workplaces are from the traditionalist or the boomer generation. So their view of the world is very, very different to the view of the people coming into the workplace. There's also another generation. Now, the reason I've put this up is because there's we've heard of Gen Z, but there's Gen Alpha. And Gen Alpha is an amazing generation. They're going to be completely and utterly different to how certainly I see the world. And the reason I put that slide up is because a few months ago I was working in Dubai, and with Dubai police. It was quite interesting. But I went into a Wagamama, you know, one of these Japanese sort of franchises. And this family came in, and they sat at the table in Wagamama, and they had a young baby, less than a year old, and they put the young baby in the high chair whilst they were having their meal. And to keep the young baby occupied, the mother gave it her smartphone. And the first action, this is a baby, because I went and had a chat to them, under 12 months old, took the smartphone, and the first automatic reaction was to do this. Yeah? Now imagine the digital natives that are going to come from this sort of generation. It's incredible, their awareness and their use of technology. My grandson, who's now sort of 15, my granddaughter who's 11, when they come and visit us, they'll be playing on an iPad, they'll have the television on, they'll be listening to music, and I'll be wanting to watch the television, want to watch some soccer, I'm from Newcastle, yeah, want to watch the football, and I'll say, look, are you listening to this stuff? Well, yes, Grandad, we are. I said, well, how can you be? You've got your earphones in, you've got your iPad, and you've got... I said, what's just happened on the television? And they can tell me. And they've developed, and there's no such thing, by the way, as multitasking. The brain cannot multitask. What it can do is switch very, very quickly. And these youngsters have learned this ability to switch between things very, very fast. I can't. I don't know about you, but I struggle with some of that stuff. And this is the generation that's going to come into work. And we have to look at whether our practices in HR and how we work with people are fit to utilize that sort of, that generation. So one of the things that we have to think about is that some of the most important innovations is not actually the technology itself, but it's how we use it and the impact that has on work. And work is changing in its nature. This is a survey, actually there's been a recent one, this is 2013, so it's 3 years out of date. But there's now been a broader survey which has certainly covers Europe. And this is fascinating. The jobs that are now disappearing or will disappear because of the advent of technology. And is anybody in here in HR who's a comp and ben manager, who works in reward? It's an interesting statistic. 96% probability is your job will disappear, which is a bit frightening, really. But this is because of the use of algorithms, yeah? There's a massive amount of things happening in terms of use of technology. Fortunately, there's things like accountants and auditors will also disappear, which I'm quite happy about. Anyway, so the work is changing its nature. With the demographics, especially in Europe, there's a deficit of 40 million skilled workers in advanced economies, and there's a surplus of 90 million people who actually haven't got the skills. Now that poses enormous issues, not only for society and countries about what they're doing about education, but increasingly it's posing issues for HR in organizations in how they train and develop people and keep them up to date with their skills. And these are some of the areas where there are challenges in future skills, current and future skills. A lot of it is around technical expertise, but the biggest one is really centered around the whole area of relationships. It's a lack of soft skills, interpersonal communication. And that's a major, major lack. The other thing that's happening increasingly with this different workforce we've got in the future is engagement is dropping. Now, I did find some data on Baltic countries, and in fact, you're a little bit above Russia, but not far. So levels of engagement in the region are not very high. So we have to rethink the relationship we have with the workforce. We have to, and the key word in there, by the way, is to engage people. You have to give them a voice, but the most important word in that is trust. You have to create an environment as HR people where people trust you. The other thing that's happening in the world of work at the moment and in the future is the amount of data we're getting is massive. The volume is growing every day. The speed at which it comes, the velocity is increasing. The variety, the range of data we can now find is absolutely massive. And the veracity is an issue. How much of it is true? How many things do we get coming through? And what's interesting is that most business leaders think one of the biggest gaps for HR is how do we actually use analytics? Are they insightful? So that's one of the key focuses in the future for HR. Let's see if I can get this to change. We have to evolve. I've used this example of the medical profession sewing off somebody's leg there, and finally it's a robot which is now operating in the workplace. And if we're going to have better working lives and better work, there's a virtuous circle. Good HR is all about context. So instead of relying on best practice, we have to start looking at principles where we really add value to the organization. But to do that, HR people need to step up and, in fact, have expertise and develop the proper expertise and increase their professionalism. And this is just a framework, because I'm going to rush through this and we can talk about it in the break if you like, is in terms of managing the future workforce, HR has to be able to provide insight on the changing context. It's got to look much more at the science of human behavior. We need to put the human back in. We need to certainly be good in terms of practices and policies, but also we need to understand the analytics. And here's a little Dilbert cartoon, which is really sort of saying the days have gone where HR was seen as just generating meaningless policies which were all about control and command. Yeah? So the questions for you, I'm going to leave you some questions. Are your people management practices actually fit for purpose? Do you make life incredibly difficult for people when they come into the organization, or do you actually make entry nice and easy? And I'm down to 0 minutes here, so I'm going to go quickly. And are we focused enough on culture? A lot of HR is focused on policies. We need to be thinking much more broadly about what sort of values, what principles, what sort of productive culture can we have in an organization. We need to go back to our roots. And these are some of the areas which are now being worked on extensively and linking them into the whole science of human behavior. You wouldn't believe that the latest research in neuroscience, which is amazing stuff, using CAT scanners, now tells us that most of the training methodologies we use in the world of work don't work. It's really, really interesting. There are several reports, by the way, you can go and get these for free on the CIPD website about neuroscience and learning and development. But the ways we use to train people are not effective. They don't link into how the brain actually really works. And then finally, I'm pulling all this together very, very rapidly. What does it mean to be a professional in this HR future world? We really have to think a lot more about social and ethical responsibility. It's about building the right knowledge of skills, body of knowledge. Incredibly, in terms of context, we have to exercise much better situational judgment. We need to think more. The capacity to critically think in our modern world is being radically reduced by the uses of technology. When you ask somebody a question, they go straight to Google. They don't think. And that capacity is disappearing in the world of work. We have to be committed to HR. HR is a truly terrific profession. I hate it when people say to me, I say, well, how did you get into HR? And they start their reply with, I ended up in HR because. And that's just not a professional. You know, for me, you really have to have a passion for it. CPD, by the way, is continuous professional development. Unless you're keeping abreast of all these changes, you'll be left behind. And we have to make sure that in organisations, and it was said earlier on, we have to have a sense of identity. And 2 questions for you. Which areas of knowledge and skills you need to be thinking about this are important in the future? And these are some dilemmas that we have to solve in HR. Does the well-being of one person matter as much as the organisation? Do hard-working, talented people deserve more money than those who need it most? Is HR there to serve people or the business? These are real questions of dilemmas that we have to resolve in this new world of ours. That's been very, very quick. Thank you very much. It's been very fast. I'm very happy to go into detail about any of those things during the breaks, or you can contact me through SVEIKI. And I hope you enjoyed that. It was very fast. Thank you. And no music.
Thank you very much, everyone.